Good evening, welcome. It's wonderful to be here tonight. We're in the James Room in Barnard Hall on campus. We have some folks who are here in person, and I'm told that we have over 800 people watching online. So I think people are really excited about this topic. My name is Sion Bailak. I'm president of Barnard, and I'm just really thrilled to have this topic here tonight. Mostly because I'm interested in it. I have a tween, so parenting and the science behind the teenage brain is something that I'm really looking for some tips and understanding for my own life. But this panel and this series, it's called Gray Matters, Parenting and the Science Behind the Teenage Brain, is part of our year-long Barnard Year of Science, which I'm so excited to celebrate with you. Really, the impetus for this Year of Science came from a desire to tell the story of how Barnard has eminence across the arts, the humanities, social sciences, and sciences. Really, our students and faculty do it all. So it's really exciting to be telling that story this year. I talk a lot about how it's not the arts, the liberal arts and sciences. The sciences are part of the liberal arts, and I think more often or more clearly than ever before, we're now understanding what it takes to be a great citizen, what it takes to be a great scholar, what it takes to be a great productive member of society, and that requires a knowledge of the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and certainly knowledge of the sciences. The last 2 years has made that very clear, not just in terms of understanding the pandemic, but how we react to the pandemic. We know that levels of stress are higher, especially among young people. We know that people are adapting to whatever the new normal is. And I think it's really an important time to step back and ask the question how we as parents, or those who know teenagers, or those who will be teenagers, what we know about how the brain develops and how we can use that knowledge and that science to actually impact how we interact and how people think and feel. And I'm so pleased tonight to be introducing Dr. Marina Catallozzi, who is going to be moderating tonight's event. Dr. Catallozzi is our Chief Health Officer, and she's our inaugural Chief Health Officer here at Barnard. She's also our Vice President for Health and Wellness. We like to give people lots of titles here. Really, this is such an exciting position. It was really the brainchild of it came before the pandemic, with the realization that in order for our students to do well and to be academically excellent, we had to be thinking about how they felt as well. Because you can't operate at a high level in the classroom, at a high level in everything you do, if you don't feel okay outside the classroom as well. And so Dr. Catallozzi comes to us as a joint appointment between Barnard and Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She at CUIMC is Vice Chair for Education in the Department of Pediatrics, Director of the General Public Health Program, and an adolescent medicine provider. She has an active practice in Washington Heights, and I learned when I interviewed Dr. Catallozzi that adolescence goes through age 26, so she's like the perfect person to be here. And in her inaugural role, she's supporting all things well-being across campus, really as we think about how we support our students, but also our faculty and staff. She will oversee our new Francine A. Lafrac Foundation Center for Wellbeing. She also oversees our primary health care and our Rosemary Furman Counseling Center, and is really bringing an amazing insight into how we think about general health and well-being across campus. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catallozzi, and I'm excited to learn a lot in this next hour.
Thank you so much, President Bailak, and really welcome to all of you who are here with us tonight in the room and also on Zoom. I wanted to start by sharing just a few insights as an adolescent health specialist and actually a parent of a 12 and 16-year-old, where I've had the opportunity to witness the effects of COVID on youth. I also want to share my excitement in having this discussion. I'm usually surrounded by pediatricians, so people who love and care about adolescents and young adults are really remarkable people. So since the COVID pandemic was announced in March 2020, we have had an unprecedented change really in the way we organize ourselves socially and in daily routine. So dizzying change has really been the only constant in the last 20 months. Adolescents and young adults, or as I call them, AYAs, were not as impacted physically initially by the virus, but they were impacted by the abrupt withdrawal from school, social lives, and outdoor activities. The stress has impacted their mental health and increased anxiety. It's changed eating patterns, school dynamics, and just the problem of a developing brain, as we'll talk about tonight, comprehending the long-term and short-term effects of this pandemic. Also, it's managing the distress of the stark inequities that we've seen socially and racially that COVID has really amplified. Just last week, I don't know if you saw this, the US Surgeon General issued an advisory on the youth mental health crisis and said that the pandemic really added to the challenges that America's youth were already facing. And that really was negatively impacting even more strongly those who were already seeing stark inequities, those who are LGBTQ, low income, in rural areas, immigrant households. But we know that it's even more far reaching in our everyday life. So when you think about what adolescents have to do, the positive here is that think of what they have done in this pandemic. We talk about resilience and people say it's an overused term, but it's one I've used my entire career. They pivoted to online learning. They developed social connection through things like TikTok, which is pretty amazing. And even when other people are not setting great examples, they've adapted their traditions and milestones and really have tried to move the significant events in their life into safe settings. And they're doing all of this when adults are stressed at this time as well. So what we're going to hear about tonight also is that resilience is not an individual activity. It is not a personality trait. It's really built by the community that you surround yourself with, and it's something that can be developed. So as we're talking about this, we really want to focus on the parenting aspect of how you can support that resilience. I was going to start with the pop quiz, but President Bylock already gave away the first answer. I was going to ask with the developing brain, when does the brain develop until? So we'll talk about that more tonight, age 26. But just to get you thinking about some things, how much sleep does a teen need? Sort of chew on that for a moment. If anyone wants to hold up numbers for me, that would be great. It's really 8 to 10 hours. Yeah, right back there, you've got the answer correct. And then what's the last part of the brain to develop? Does anyone know that part? Yep, pointing in the right direction, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex I like to call the CEO of the brain, the decision maker, and it really makes sense, and we'll talk about that tonight as well. So before welcoming our incredible panelists, for those of you who are attending in person, I want to bring your attention to note cards and pens that are on your seats. Towards the end of the event, we will have a Q&A portion. So use those cards to write down your question, and we'll collect them right before the Q&A. For those of you on Zoom, you can submit them and we will get them onto a document so we can ask. Now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists who I guess I'm fan-personing over as I've been reading your work in preparation for tonight. The first is B.J. Casey, who's a professor of psychology at Yale University and a faculty member of the Justice Collaboratory at the Yale School of Law and of the Interdepartmental Neuroscience Program of Yale School of Medicine. She pioneered the use of functional MRI to examine the developing human brain, particularly during adolescence, accelerating the emerging field of developmental cognitive neuroscience. Her scientific discoveries have been published in over 220 articles, Nature Medicine, Nature Neuroscience, PNAS, cited over 65,000 times, highlighted by NPR, PBS, the New York Times, National Geographic. She's received numerous honors, including the Thomson Reuters World's Most Influential Mind Award and the Association for Psychological Science Lifetime Achievement Mentor Award, and was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She served on scientific advisory boards, panels, including the NIH's NIMH Board of Scientific Counselors and Advisory Council, and numerous other decision makers, particularly those around sports-related concussions in youth. Her work has also been cited in amicus briefs presented to the Supreme Court on sentencing of young people, and she's presented to congressional staff on Capitol Hill. Perhaps most exciting is that BJ will join the faculty at Barnard in the Department of Neuroscience and Behavior in the fall of 2022. Really exciting. Adriana Galvan is a Barnard graduate in the class of 2001, also a professor of psychology and the dean of undergraduate education at UCLA. She is the director of Developmental Neuroscience Lab and co-executive director of the Center for the Developing Adolescents. Her scholarly work focuses on understanding the adolescent brain and behavior with a focus on motivation, learning, and risk-taking, and an eye towards informing youth-relevant policy. Adriana received her BA from Barnard and PhD in neuroscience from Cornell University. She's received multiple awards for her work, including the National Academy of Sciences, a Fulbright Award, and the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Finally, our final panelist, Russell Romeo, is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and Behavior and chair here of the Department of Psychology. His research and teaching interests are in developmental neuroscience with a specific focus on adolescent neurobehavioral development and stress. He's published over 100 articles, reviews, book chapters on these topics, recently co-authoring a book published by Oxford University, Coming of Age, the Neurobiology and Psychobiology of Puberty and Adolescence. Excellent book. He's received the Gladys Brooks Excellence in Teaching Award and the Emily Gregory Award for Excellence in Teaching and Exceptional Devotion and Service to the students of Barnard. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to tonight's event. Welcome. And as I am walking over, I would love for our panelists to start answering the following question. How has the course of the pandemic impacted the teenage brain? And BJ, I'd love to start with you. Then everybody, if you could take about 2 minutes to talk about this impact on the teenage brain.
I want to just begin by saying that I think the past 2 years in the pandemic is, and will continue to impact the adolescent brain, as well as social, cognitive, physical, and mental health. And while we're only beginning to be able to have in-person MRIs of youth again, given the pandemic and the period of time when we were shelter in place, there is a large study funded by the National Institutes of Health called the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, or for short, ABCD. This study is following almost 12,000 youth across the country and looking at brain development and health. And preliminary findings already are perhaps not surprising, but what we're seeing is increased anxiety, depression, and stress in these youth that they're reporting. And some of the biggest predictors of these mental health issues are sex. So females, we're seeing this more in them than others. And also another risk factor is either experiencing or observing discrimination and racism, particularly related to COVID. Now, there is a silver lining, and it's a silver lining that I think is a very important message for parents. And that is that they're playing a big role in terms of being a buffer. So some of the predictors for individuals who are doing well have positive communications with their parents and families. They also, when they have conversations with their parents about the activities and structure of the day, that is important too, and also regular planned meals. So in this pandemic of uncertainty that we're still experiencing, this structure and just a little bit of certainty goes a long way. And I think that's a very important message for parents to hear, because too often we talk about or exaggerate, perhaps not exaggerate, but we focus on peers and their influence. And I think parents don't feel like they are having an impact when in fact they are.
To you about those changes during COVID.
I'm happy to go next. Like BJ said, I mean, we're learning a lot through something like the ABCD study, as well as many other studies, I'm sure. I think two things to keep in mind, and again, BJ touched on this a little bit, which is the type of stressors that particularly adolescents are going through during this time and continue to go through. Because most of my work is in non-human animal research, and there's a couple things that we know about stress responses and what can make them more or less. And there's two things to keep in mind. Is it seems one of the controllability of the stressors are very important to how individuals respond to stressors. And the more controllability one feels they have over the stressor, typically the less responsive they are to it, or at least the less the negative impact is. And that's obviously been very difficult, particularly for adolescents during this time. I mean, it's all somewhat uncontrollable for us, but imagine that even more so in younger people. And the other is and again, BJ touched upon this, the sort of social influences and social buffering that can happen. Again, something that we know from a lot of the non-human animal research is the sort of, when you're being stressed, being near a peer, or a conspecific in this case, can actually buffer the response that one has. And at the very beginning, particularly during lockdown, I imagine those sort of peer relations were strained, sometimes non-existent. And yes, there have been ways of that peer interaction coming back online, and now in person more so. But I think those are at least a couple of things, the controllability in this social interactions that just perhaps have made this pandemic that much more difficult from the stress perspective on adolescent individuals and young people in general.
Thank you for the question, Marina. One thing that resonates with what both BJ and Russ have said is that the pandemic has allowed us and given us the opportunity to focus on adolescence as a critical time of development to invest in. And I don't mean investment just in terms of financial investment, but in terms of attention and effort and policy making. And as you mentioned, the Surgeon General report that just came out last week focused on how this is a whole society issue, that all of us can do something to support adolescents. We've learned that the pandemic has been stressful for adolescents, but life has been stressful for adolescents for decades before the pandemic. And the way that their brain responds has a lot to do with the communities that they grow up in, the support that they have, the parents that they are reared by, and the schools that they engage with. And all of these things can support adolescents in ways that we have a renewed interest in from the pandemic. We've learned that they have been socially isolated, and decades of research have shown that they really thrive on the social relationships that they build during adolescence. So how can we support that? How can we make mental health as important as physical health? We know that the holistic approach to supporting adolescents is a way to help them transition into adulthood. And so knowing that the brain changes through 25 or 26 or 27 is important as a baseline for thinking of the many developmental transitions that they undergo during adolescence, from roughly the ages of 10, 11, and 12 through the mid-20s. And so the pandemic, it's challenging to say how exactly it has changed adolescence or impacted adolescence. But what we know and what we've learned from it is that a renewed interest in this period of life is important, and that adolescence is worth investing in every single way that we can invest in any developmental group.
So great to hear that positive response. And I think both in discussion, BJ, about the buffering that parents can really bring, and Adriana, your discussion of community investment. So as we are turning our focus finally to adolescents, you have to ask yourself, why do they do what they do? Because to be able to make that investment, we need people to understand what is risk-taking, why impulsive behavior. So Adriana, I would love to start with you and then hear from everyone really. Why is it they make the decisions they do? And how can parents really understand it in a way to then be able to support their teen?
Thank you. It's no coincidence that the adolescents engage in behaviors that from the adult perspective may be perceived as risk-taking or poor decision-making, but it is all a part of learning through trial and error. So throughout our lives, we learn through trial and error. We learned how to crawl and to walk by taking risks. And as people become adolescents, that risk moves from being physical risks to other types of risks. And certainly it can get some adolescents into trouble, but it is an important part of learning about the environment, of learning how to bond with others, of how to become adults and to have confidence in one's decision making. So Sorry, what was the question?
Really, yeah, I mean, I think you've definitely
did.
got it. I often will ask the question of people, has anyone here ever taken a risk?
Right.
And to understand yourself, you really have to push the envelope. So I think
Yeah.
you're exactly explaining it.
Yeah.
So that was, you answered it.
Okay, good.
BJ, did you want
So,
to comment?
I'll just add to that by saying some of the changes that we're seeing in the brain during this period of time, I think have been beautifully sculpted, and we've evolved so that reward centers and emotional centers seem to be changing dramatically during adolescence. No surprise to parents, because you see this lability and emotions, the highs and the lows. But we think the adaptive aspect of this, to build on Adriana's comments, is that many children have the comfort of home, they have shelter, they have food, even clean clothes. And so it would take something to sort of push them out to explore. And we think that's why we're seeing these changes in reward systems that would help them explore and learn from their environments. However, we also are seeing changes in emotional related centers that are trying to learn about the emotional significance of their environment. And these seem to be in overdrive. And so this is also a time when we see increased risk for anxiety. And often we'll find that our youth will ruminate on something that they find potentially threatening or that worries them, like even just an interaction with a peer where there's no expression. And it may not have any significance whatsoever, but there may be an overinterpretation of something must be wrong because they're not engaging with me. So these emotional and reward centers in the brain that are so important about learning about safety and incentives appear to go into almost overdrive in stressful situations. And it's been suggested that they do the equivalent of hijacking this prefrontal cortical region and related projections that Marina mentioned. She calls it a CEO for Star Trek fans. I call it the Vulcan part of the brain, the rational part, but most importantly, we know it's involved in thinking about the future consequences of our actions. And this is where we see often decisions go awry. In the heat of the moment, even if an individual knows better, they may engage in that risky behavior. It may get them into trouble. And often they're not thinking about the future consequences of that action. So these are some of the changes that we're seeing in the brain, and why we think we see teens do what they do.
And just we'll add from like a cross-species perspective that, this is a stage in life when we're going from dependence on a caregiver to independence of a caregiver, and it takes a certain amount of kind of moxie, so to speak, to get out there. And I think, yes, risk-taking can be risky, but there's also sort of pressure for it, so that one can get out, explore, establish their own territory, so to speak. So I think it's not just something uniquely human in that sense either.
I think, sorry, Marina.
I was just thinking about the way that you all are presenting it in this developmental way is so helpful. When you see a 0 to 3-year-old kind of develop the capacity to crawl, walk, the thing is that they almost always are advancing forward. With teens, it seems like there's a slip back sometimes. They can do it in some situations or make good decisions in some situations, but not others. So at what point does the teenage brain reach adulthood? At what point, when parents say, like, are they ever going to grow up? Are they always going to be sort of slipping back? Can you talk about that a bit?
So I just want to build on Russ's points, because I think it's very important for us to take a step back and say, so what is adolescence, for us to define when it might possibly end? And it really is this transitional period where the individual, that youth, is learning how to be a contributing member of society. They need to take on adult roles. And that's why they need to explore boundaries of the social rules to learn from them. Now, if it's a transitional period, we think of its onset around puberty, And its offset would be when they're being relatively independent of their parent. Now, my son is 27, and he will tell me, if we're talking about financial independence, that he's going to be an adolescent for a few more years. But what we're seeing from the neurocognitive data and the developmental science, and so this is just referring to looking at changes in cognitive ability and also significantly functional changes in the brain. They continue into the early to mid-20s, and that's why we have new definitions for adolescence of basically from 10 to 25. So if we think about it, and Mark.
And BJ, I think what you said really speaks to the bidirectional influence of just ontogeny and biology and the environment, right? So adolescence isn't just shaped by the age they are or the developmental stage in high school or college, but really their environment, economics, their socioeconomic status, all of those contribute to how long we will extend adolescence. And so this is why the Surgeon General's report, as to your point, speaks to all the different domains and stakeholders who influence adolescents have a role in shaping their well-being.
And I think the point of intersectionality you bring up is so critically important, because the environment that they're in, the community that they're in, is really helping to support that development or not, which is really quite critical. I'm interested in, people are worried about stress in adolescence. They're worried about what is that impact, and is it the stress of taking an exam or exam period, as everyone is experiencing now in the community, or is it the more long-term stress, and what kind of architectural changes happen, and what kind of social changes happen in response? Maybe we'll start with you, Russ.
Well, yeah, I'll give this a shot first. And I mean, we know stress at any point in the lifespan can affect the structure and function of the nervous system. But specifically talking about how stress may impact the adolescent nervous system, I can tell you, I'm sure Adriana and BJ can follow up a little bit more on some of the functional impacts that stress will have, but I can tell you about some of the structural influences it has. And again, these would be studies that we know from using non-human animals, where we can get at the cellular level. And so if you picture in your mind a brain cell, you probably think of a cell with a bunch of little projections coming off of it. And those little projections are called dendrites, and that's where a lot of the information comes into these brain cells. If you look at those brain cells under chronic stress, those dendrites often show a retraction or pulling back. And since this is where a lot of the information is coming into these cells, the implication of those structural changes is now that cell is not capable of integrating as much information. And this happens in neurons within regions of the brain exposed to chronic stress. A couple of areas to mention are the hippocampus. We know this is an important brain region for learning and memory. And also the prefrontal cortex, something that we've already talked about this evening, the CEO or the bulk inside of the nervous system. And so both of those areas show this dendritic retraction, and maybe that explains why some of the behavioral changes we see, like poor learning and memory because of the hippocampal involvement, and sort of mental flexibility, less mental flexibility under chronic stress because of the effects on the prefrontal cortex. But that's not to say that stress affects the brain equally. Some areas of the brain, those neurons aren't affected at all. And some show the opposite pattern, an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is a very important in threat detection and fear memory processes. Those dendrites show the opposite pattern. They grow, they become more branched and are presumably able to integrate more information, and that may play into the increased threat detection and fear memories that might be developed during periods of chronic stress. So those are some of the things it can do at the sort of cellular structural level. But just to end on a positive note, one thing that we do know is that these effects of stress on the structure of these neurons is reversible. Even within a couple of days, if the stressor is removed, these cells can start to readapt back to their previous size and shape. So at any rate, there are these significant structural effects of chronic stress, but thankfully most of those are reversible. And maybe I can turn it over to the other two to talk about some of the functional effects.
That really resonates with something I've been thinking about, that across 50 years of research, we know that disasters or community violence or things that affect societies as a whole have shown that even though there's an uptick in distress and stress-related behaviors immediately after the event, this research suggests that most people do not go on to develop lifelong impairments. And so this really speaks to your note about reversibility and how, particularly during adolescence, when the brain is highly plastic, there is opportunity to reverse those potentially negative impacts of whatever stressor there is, including a pandemic.
So let me just add to that and remind us that our brain is adapting and learning from the environment. And so when there's a stressor, it's important for it to focus on the stressor and try to understand it. And so that's why we may see ruminations and trying to focus on the stress, trying to learn from it. And a little bit of stress is good for us. If there's not a little bit of tension, then we don't tend to be as aroused or perhaps focused or attentive. It's when it is acute or chronic. But as Russ was mentioning, some of the work that we have done in collaboration with the late Bruce McEwen, is looking at rodents who were experiencing chronic stress, but we also looked at young people who were medical students when they were studying for the boards. That's a real stressor. And what we saw in humans is that there was decreased connectivity with that prefrontal area of the brain. Now, would I say that medical students are brain damaged? No, after they took the boards and they went on vacation, when you looked again at the brain, that connectivity looked comparable to a comparison group that wasn't studying for boards and did not report stress. And also, their cognitive abilities changed. They were much more flexible in where they could direct their attention and less ruminating.
I feel like this really resonates with our approach to wellness here, really thinking about, in times of stress or distress, what do you rely on? What are the physical activities? How do you support your mental health? You mentioned your son's financial dependence, right? Building up that financial wellness. One thing that always comes into play certainly for residents who I've told it's a short-term stress, don't worry, you'll recover from this. What about sleep? Are the young people in our country getting enough sleep? And if not, what can we do to support that?
I love talking about sleep. Sleep is so important because we focus a lot on sleep in the early postnatal years when young parents want to support their child's sleep because it impacts their sleep. But equally important is sleep during adolescence. And we know that with the additional pressures of adolescence, including academic pressures, social media, there is what the National Sleep Foundation has called a sleep epidemic among adolescents, that they are not receiving enough sleep. And just as important as sleep duration is sleep quality. So there's research showing that if you give adolescents an actigraph, which is a sleep watch, and measures how efficient their sleep is, how much sleep are they getting relative to how much deep sleep they are getting, which is the quality sleep, there's a decline as people transition into puberty. And that is important to know because there are ways to support increased sleep, supporting regular sleep patterns or providing sleep environments that are more conducive to sleep. So there was a recent study published from Los Angeles showing that adolescents who have optimal lighting or temperature or sleep environment or bedding, all of that can contribute to optimizing sleep health. And that is so important for how well they're able to pay attention in school the next day, their ability to form relationships with other people, their impulse control. And that are all of those things are important for adolescents' behavior. And so sleep is crucial.
I think that it's so helpful to hear that, and I think that for parents to know that supporting that and how to support it operationally is really helpful. BJ, you sounded like you were going to say something about the sleep, which we definitely want to hear.
I was just going to add in, everyone in this room knows when you haven't had enough sleep, you're going to be emotionally dysregulated and impulsive. So we know for teens who are particularly susceptible to emotional dysregulation and being impulsive when they're emotionally aroused, that we're going to see an even exacerbated response in them. And there have been societal changes too. We've started, many youth end up having to leave home very early in the morning to go to school. And so there have been some experimental trials looking at when you delay the opening of the school. So I think there are many structural ways in which we can help to reinforce that, besides just what we're doing at home as well. And also, it's important to think about phones and screen time, because there may be many of us who continue to work on those or feel like we need to respond for work, or checking to make sure our youth are okay. So that's also going to be an important aspect of change.
And I think there was a lot of hope during the pandemic that when we went back to our lives, that perhaps some adjustments would be made, but that has to be made for everyone, for parents, for kids, and we haven't quite seen that. You talked about phones and social media, and I think one thing parents are always wondering is, does it really make a difference if their peers are thinking about things in a different way and have such strong influence? So how can parents be reassured that their opinions matter at least as much as their peers?
Well,
love to hear that.
So I think I've already touched on this a bit with regard to the importance that parents have with the findings from the ABCD study. But we can, what's important to keep in mind is they're same age peers, and they're also slightly older peers that can have a real impact on adolescents' behavior. And I just want to provide one example of how we tried to stay connected with young people while we had remote assessments for these youth in the ABCD study that we were seeing, once a year, and then some of them we had to do everything remotely. And what the staff, who aren't that much older than the teens, were doing were finding activities where they could engage the youth. And I think the best one was in reference to how they've connected with TikToks. So the teenager wanted to teach the 6 staff how to do a new dance. And they recorded this on Zoom, and then they sent this to me. And it's the most hilarious Zoom recording that I have seen related to our research, because there were a few that got it right away, and there were a few that were never going to get it. But the connection, the teen felt that she was teaching them something as opposed to her being just a participant in the study. And I think that was an important connection in empowering her and also making her feel important, but also seeing we can all poke fun of ourselves too. And peers can be very supportive, but we also know that peers can be hurtful. And in these times when we're not interacting in person, when we reduce it to social media, that can sometimes be devastating, particularly if someone misinterprets it and reads it wrong. This can lead to a dysregulation and imbalance where they just ruminate on those factors. So thinking about having a real support for youth and activities for them to engage in. And also, I just want to underscore structure again. So there's some certainty and structure in their life as opposed to what some of us did during the beginning of the pandemic, and that was our schedule kind of fell apart because there was no real structure to it.
BJ, I think you raise a really important point about providing opportunities for autonomy and independent seeking and building respect from adults, for example, in the staff who work on the ABCD study, recognizing that there's a lot of value in providing youth with the opportunity for them to teach something and to remain engaged in a way that they are the experts in a particular issue, TikTok being number one.
Yeah, and I really like that idea of you stay relevant by being aware, so you don't need to be the star of the TikTok show as a parent, but having an awareness, supporting them, this idea of building confidence, competence, and also, what you're saying about helping others, teaching others. We know that altruism is something that is really important to young people, and particularly during this difficult time of challenges. I would encourage people to put some answers in. I'm going to ask for some closing remarks, and Russ, we'll start with you. Just a takeaway for everyone, really, what can or should parents do during this pandemic and after to support young people? Really, what are some main takeaways?
Well, I mean, the support providing some sort of predictability, ideally. We're talking about organization, supporting reconnecting with peers. That's slowly happening, and slowly but surely happening. But again, sort of helping that process along. I also just think that one thing that parents can do is encourage their teen to maintain physical activity as just one sort of basic tip. One thing that we know that physical activity in lots of different forms, it doesn't have to be one particular type of exercise, but just being able to engage in that physical activity, we know elevates mood. We know that it can reduce the symptoms of anxiety and depression, and it's good for not just the physical health, but mental health as well. And one thing we know about physical activity, again, from learning from the non-human animal research, is that it opens up windows of plasticity in the brain. And it would be nice to see parents and caregivers encouraging adolescent individuals to engage in more in that physical activity as we continue to deal with the stressors of the pandemic and beyond. So that's just some advice.
Such a wonderful suggestion. I know there's some grandparents on here saying, like, what can we do? And that idea of really encouraging that physical activity and opening things up is great. Adriana?
Thank you, Russ. One thing that physical activity does is energize the reward centers in the brain. And we know that adolescence is a time of life when reward sensitivity is really high. And so capitalizing on how rewarding many different things are for adolescents is important. It's not just physical activity. It's spending time and bonding with a friend. It's simple things like BJ loves chocolate. So chocolate is another thing. So many different ways of rewarding adolescents and reminding ourselves that it may not be the same rewards that we find as adults, but the adolescent brain is primed to be motivated by them. And I think that's something to keep in mind during this challenging time.
I think what I would say is, as a parent or caregiver, we want to protect our youth. We want to protect our teen. And I think it's important to find that balance when we allow them to explore and to take risks, to allow them to fail when they have the support of us. I used to think that if I locked up my son until he was 21, everything would be okay. Well, that's not the way the brain works. Our brain is learning and adapting to the environment. So it's very important for us to provide youth with opportunities to experience successes, but also to reach high and sometimes experience failures so that they can learn to regulate their responses to those. That's going to be very important in regulating the self and becoming a contributing member of society. So I think it's just important to find that balance and to also, because Adriana has talked about the reward system so much, and we know there's a real heightened sensitivity to rewards at this time. It's important to catch your child being good. And I say catch because sometimes our teenagers, because we care about them, we want to protect them, we want to try to change the bad. But the best way to alter behavior is to reinforce them when they are engaged in positive behaviors. So I think those 2 points.
Yeah, and I think this relates, thank you so much for those takeaways. I think it's so helpful. It also relates to one of the first questions we got, which is this balance of you want to give opportunities, independence. When do you support and help? When do you swoop in? And I know there's the kind of worry of helicopter parenting, now this new scaffolding parenting that's come up with COVID. But how do you balance that? How do you make those decisions so that decisions can be made in support? Do you want to start, Adriana, that one?
Sure, that's a really hard question because as parents, we always want to help. We always want to provide the scaffolding, but that is a normative developmental milestone, is to be able to problem solve and to have the tools to appreciate when something truly is a disaster and you need reinforcement, and when it's okay to not have all the answers. And I think that's a challenge that parents really face, and I get a lot of questions about it. And one way to think about it is that adolescents do need, and young adults do need that space to feel the gifts that come from feeling that you solve something on your own.
That's great advice. I wonder how that ties in to when do you offer help in terms of counseling, support, and Russ, related to kind of the stressors you talked about, at what point do you recognize, okay, this is long-term stress now, I need to step in?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because I think it's also going to be different on the individual, and but it's very difficult to tell when that intervention would be necessary. I do think that there, as we've been talking about, the idea of at least the possibility of failure should not be underestimated. I think it's important to try and to fail, to problem solve. And the real big question is, if they're really impacted so negatively by that failure and there starts to be some sort of rumination or some sort of more difficult process psychologically, then how does one sort of come in and help? It's a very difficult question. Quite frankly, I don't know the answer, but I think if nothing else, just being aware and sort of checking in, maybe not all the time and swooping in at the every second, but kind of being connected, keeping those lines of communication open, because that, if nothing else, can at least help you maybe notice some more things when that intervention would be necessary. But it's a very difficult question to answer.
So I might just add, so our youth aren't just stressed during this, but parents are too. Many of us are functioning right at threshold. So if anything goes wrong, we are reactive too. And I think if we can just remind ourselves to push that hold button when a young person comes in and they explode, or they use language that they don't typically use, or that's not acceptable, or if they say or do something to try to put things in slow motion and to count, and give the individual an opportunity to regulate themselves, because when we respond to their action, we just often escalate. So if I can just give a quick example, even before the pandemic, when my son was just entering adolescence, he came home and he used language that I don't even use. And I was so shocked, I couldn't say anything. And of course, then his response is, oh, well, don't say anything. But then he goes up to his room, and he's an adolescent, and so he's hungry for dinner, and I was cooking it. He came down about an hour later, and he doesn't even have eye contact with me, because he knows that he recognizes his behavior. And we looked at the food together as I was stirring it, and I just said, a bad day? And he said, yeah. And I said, are you hungry? And he said, yeah. And it was just, I realized it wasn't because I knew to do better, but giving him that moment for him to quiet down. And we talked later in terms of just things that had happened during the day, but part of it is he was really hungry too, is important, because that's giving them the opportunity to regulate. And too quickly we want to sweep in and we want to go, what is the problem, and challenging them when they're not quite ready is often exactly what's going to trigger it escalating. And again, that's recognizing that parents are really at threshold, so it's very easy to be reactive when our young people are too.
And I think, BJ, that highlights that you were recognizing that it was a change in his behavior, right? You recognized it, and then by what you said to him, it was acknowledging for him that this isn't you. Right. Something must have happened today that caused this reaction that I'm not accustomed to. And that's also important to your point, Russ, about how we can stay aware of our adolescents is by recognizing things that are changing, and not just in their expression of behavior and emotion, but in their sleep, in their eating patterns, in their activity. All of those things are related, right? None of those things are separate from the other.
And I think that idea of staying so connected, also the recognition that some parents were at threshold and families were at threshold prior to the pandemic, and that there can be some real as I was a first generation student, and I recall to people and often tell other parents, talk to your kids when you're driving. You don't have to make eye contact. Those were the best conversations I had with my father, who couldn't understand where things were coming from. But even now, just really thinking about when you're giving a young person the opportunity to speak without having to make eye contact or be overwhelmed, really an important piece. So what would you tell the young people? Really, what advice do you have for adolescents, teens at this point? Because we've given a lot of advice to the parents tonight. BJ, I'll start with you.
Go, BJ. Go ahead.
I think one, they need to give themselves a break. Young people are really beating themselves up, and this extends into our brilliant college students, where not only are they handling here at Barnard, at Yale, at UCLA, and so many other institutions, if we think about our students, they don't only have the stress and the challenge of academia, but also in terms of the stressors and challenges of maintaining relationships with their peers, and their opportunities for engaging in extracurricular activities. So it's like there's so many things that are uncertain in terms of when you can engage in them and when you can't, and when we wear masks and when we should be safe. And so I really think give yourself a break and make sure that you, if you at least have a buddy system or someone that you can relate to. It's just very important to be connected, and that parents are there, even if you think they're nags. They are wonderful resources, and they want to listen, and they're interested, as are all the faculty and everyone at these institutions. Just want to be there and listen and help.
I would just add, as far as like a really specific piece of advice, and this goes back to what Adriana was saying and to something that BJ was mentioning too, about sleep. Don't underestimate the need of it. And I know a lot of students particularly think staying up late to study, pulling all-nighters, particularly around finals time, which we're in the throes of, that's somehow going to help or improve performance. But we know the exact opposite is true. And getting your rest when you've just been studying and actually sleeping helps consolidate those memories and consolidate that learning, and you will perform better. There is evidence to show that. So I think as a specific piece of advice, don't underestimate the necessity of sleep and sleep quality in making sure that you can perform optimally, but also have the physical and mental health that you're capable of.
I think I just want to add that I hope you're having a good time, because this is such a good time. I was a Barnard student. I sat in this hall many times, and I remember so much more of the times I was having a good time rather than the times I was up late studying. So I hope you're doing that, because your brain is paying attention, and in fact, there's a term for it. It's called the reminiscence bump, whereby you remember things that you experienced as an adolescent or young adult because your brain is holding on to those really rewarding experiences. So do it, because it won't come, it'll come in different ways when you're older.
I wish we had another hour to talk. This has been so helpful. And the corollaries, I would say, are for parents, encourage your young people to develop community, get some sleep, and remember to have a good time. So that's really helpful. So thank you all, President Bylock, our esteemed panelists, so much information here, the whole Barnard community, really for joining us for this important and really insightful event. I'm really hoping this has given you some helpful information. We are going to be sharing a tip sheet and answering further of the questions, really to give you some actionable items going forward. I really want to also give a special thank you to Princeton University Press for sponsoring this event with us today. They've given everyone a discount code for 30% off their publications. We'll share that code with you all via email. And before we go, I do also want to remind you, as President Bylock mentioned earlier, that we are in the midst of this year of science. It's a year-long celebration of all things STEM, and it's really exciting to see sort of the crossover and really just the incredible speakers we've been able to have as part of our community. So thank you again. During this year, our entire community is really coming together, showcasing this work, and we hope you continue to be part of it. To learn more about Barnard's Eminence in Science with faculty, students, alumni, all are working on, and details about the events, visit our yearofscience.barnard.edu. And thank you again. I really just want to give a round of applause for our panelists, just so amazing. And I will try to implement some of this great advice starting this evening. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.